Survivors of Desert Storm, welcome. At least most of us know where we were when the storm broke, safely inside, firmly glued to our television sets. Well, now we get a chance to meet some of the people who brought us that extraordinary production we call Primetime War. They represent those who called the shots editorially, the anchor people, the reporters who covered the war under military restrictions and independently, and importantly, the critics who like to think they hold the public pulse. We're going to show you a number of video clips to electrify our memories, and then talk to particular panelists on those aspects and invite your questions. And there really should be a lot of challenging questions. The objective of all this is to assess the impact of the Gulf War coverage both on the media and on you, the viewer, and thus on the future. It's truly a privilege to introduce a panel of this class, so let me begin. From Germany, Birgit Weidinger. She edits the media page of Süddeutsche Zeitung, one of the most respected German newspapers. From Britain, Peter Bell of the BBC. He has the august title of editor for television news programming, which means he calls the managerial and editorial shots. From the United States, Michael Arland, critic, essayist for The New Yorker, author of that classic on Vietnam and the media, The Living Room War. He has been taking the public pulse for a generation now. From CNN, a by now familiar face, Charles Beerbauer. As chief White House correspondent, Charles is every nuance he relayed was assessed worldwide. He's had at least 20 years as a foreign correspondent, dating back to the Yom Kippur War. A particular value of his presence is that CNN perhaps set a new standard in terms of international reach, certainly set a new pace that everyone else tried to emulate. From CBS, Bob McEwen, who now operates out of New York. You'll remember him, of course, from the Fifth Estate. McEwen was, in fact, first into Kuwait City without military supervision. From NBC, Arthur Kent, an Alberta boy who now operates out of Rome, 18 years in journalism, did stints in the pool in Saudi Arabia. A veteran, despite those young looks of Afghanistan, upheaval in East Europe, notably a coverage in Romania that won 2 National News Emmys. From Canada now, Brian Stewart of the CBC, one of the most traveled foreign correspondents. I feel he has shown us the human face of wars and famine as few other reporters have done. And his experience ranges from the Falklands War to Lebanon to the Gulf. He can trace the escalation of technological warfare and provide historical perspective. Peter Mansbridge, anchor, of course, of CBC's nightly news, The National, and CBC's chief correspondent, a reporter for 22 years who has the awesome responsibility of being the voice we turn to trustingly. Me, I'm here as a kind of ghost of wars past. Not too visibly, I hope. Primetime War, it's an evocative title. It's frightening, exhilarating, confusing all at once. War mixed up in the schedule where usually you look for the soaps and the sports scores. As such, war made addictive, even entertaining, and at times glamorized. So that on the one hand, war sure is hell, and on the other hand, Arthur Kent can now dine out as the Scud Stuff. Make that dine in. It's an example of the confusion of values we went through in those first hectic hours of live coverage of the war. And I think we have a clip now where we'll recall how totally transfixed we all became, I mean everybody, with the phenomenon of war live.
David, once again, U.S. officials are glued to their television sets to try and find out just what is going on in the Middle East.
We're going to New York at the UN, where Jeannie Mose is standing by and has been copying all that we've had to say. Jeannie.
The Secretary General of the United Nations is up in his office right now watching TV, we're told.
The radio here now is broadcasting CNN live. The Foreign Ministry also is watching CNN.
The best reporting that I've seen on what transpired in Baghdad was on CNN. It would appear, based upon the comments that were coming in from the CNN crew in the hotel in Baghdad, that the operation was successful in striking targets with a high degree of precision. At least that's the reporting according to CNN.
To what extent were those television reports beneficial to you in evaluating the success of the air campaign?
I really don't know, because I don't have a TV set down at my command center. But in retrospect, after getting a chance to look at some of the playbacks, I think I'm going to put a television set in.
At UCLA this morning, when news crews came to a peace demonstration, protesters crowded around the TV microwave truck to watch the latest pictures from the Gulf. In Arlington, Texas, Gayla Miller went shopping, but ended up watching TV.
You know, it's kind of hard to get motivated to do anything because you're worried about what's going to happen over there.
Wednesday night, when President Bush told the nation we were at war with Iraq, it was the most watched event in television history.
And now we're waiting. It's not quite prime missile time yet.
I'm now going to show you a picture of the luckiest man in Iraq on this particular day. Keep your eye on the crosshairs. Right through the crosshairs. And now in his rearview mirror. Okay, stop the tape, please.
Iraq's Dawa Party is broadcasting that the U.S. air raid has already caused hundreds of civilian casualties.
If that's the fact, then why haven't they gone out with their Iraqi television cameras and filmed it and provided it to the television networks?
I'm not vouching for the veracity of this.
Iraq will now use captured airmen as human shields. But first, they paraded the POWs on Iraqi TV.
What's your opinion of this aggression against Iraq?
I think this war is crazy and should never have happened. I condemn this aggression against peaceful Iraq.
For most Americans today, watching their captured pilots on TV was far more riveting than bomb damage assessments. It was a chilling reminder of similar TV appearances by shaken American prisoners in Vietnam, and a sobering signal that while his war machine may be weakened, Saddam Hussein's ability to fire propaganda shots is still intact.
A psychologist worries about people who can't escape the news.
I think these people are going to be going pretty crazy pretty quick. It's just too much overload.
Today, for the first time since Wednesday night, viewers began to complain about all the war news. Here in Los Angeles, the calls were 2-1 in favor of a break. And there was a break this afternoon. The first show on television not dealing with the war in Iraq, The Young and the Restless.
To my mind, the back to square one question that should be the thread of this entire discussion here is why live? Why this rush to go live? Charles Beerbauer of CNN, would you take a minute or two and go through the pre-planning of CNN, which certainly set the pace, and answer this question of why live? And did you have any idea that you were opening a Pandora's box?
Well, I think really, Michael, the Pandora's box had been opened well before this. What we've seen in the sequence of events briskly depicted here was what we had reached a capability of doing. This didn't all happen overnight on the 16th of January. What this was the culmination of years in the works of developing the technology and the ability to get out there and present live television from so many different locations. You know, I'm sure we've all seen the Saturday Night Live character that Al Franken has created, the guy with the satellite dish on his helmet. And those of us in the business said, when it comes to that, I'm out of here. Well, it was too late. It's already come to that. While Franken's approach is a caricature, I'm sure that the gentlemen who were out in Kuwait and out in Saudi Arabia sometimes felt very much like that individual who's got everything stuffed into a backpack and is literally a one-man uplink, or at least a several-man uplink out in the middle of the desert. The question that arises in my mind is the technology driving our coverage, or is our coverage exploiting the technology that is available to us? And the answer is, in some cases one, in some cases the other. To be sure, not all of this war, in fact, a relatively small portion of it, came to our living rooms and our offices and our studios live. I had dinner with a four-star general a couple of weeks ago who said, you know, the real untold story here is how much fighting was going on that was not reported, that was not seen, that was out in the midst of the desert, out where the Republican Guards were being engaged, and how much of the air war we really never saw. We saw those little clips that the General Schwarzkopf was proud to show off with the motorcyclists going across the bridge, and we saw the smart bombs going down chimneys and in doorways, but we certainly did not see all that much of it. The networks brought as much of it to us, to you, as we were able to. And when it was good, the coverage was terrific, and when it was bad, it was sometimes alarming.
I think what we're trying to get at here is whether the, is this mic booming? Whether the technology and the competitiveness is shaping the nature of the coverage we get. I mean, Peter Bell, it's been said that we have a new technology looking for editorial direction. At BBC, you were the man giving that editorial direction. I would stress that the BBC is in a pretty unique position in that in no degree is it dependent on commercial considerations. It should be able to establish its own style of coverage no matter what anybody else is doing. But in fact, did accuracy suffer to immediacy?
Perhaps a measure of CNN's achievement in the Gulf War, especially on day one, with those unforgettable descriptions from a Baghdad hotel window, that even in Britain, people almost automatically speak of this as the television war. And indeed that we find ourselves here today at a seminar entitled Primetime War. I think it's worthwhile at the very beginning just measuring this phrase television war against the yardstick of what actually happened. Because I think that those magic moments on CNN at the beginning and various other memorable shots, such as cruise missiles flying through the sky, the like of which we had not previously seen, may have left us to some extent with a misleading impression. I'm not really sure that this was a television war in the true sense. It certainly wasn't a war, and Charles has hinted at this already, which was televised. There may have been hours and hours of coverage. 13, I think, was the peak that we reached on the BBC in a single day. But the real war did not, in fact, happen in front of the cameras. On the contrary, hard information about what was going on was extremely limited, and it was heavily controlled. Pictures of the real action were almost non-existent. So you might ask, if there was so little hard news, how come there was so much television? Well, speaking from my own experience, what happened, I think, after months and months of waiting was that a crescendo of public interest built up. Public appetite for information, even crumbs of information, was intense, legitimate, and certainly in Britain you could measure it in the ratings, at least for a period of time.
Peter, I made the point in putting the question to you that really you had nobody else to answer to in competitive terms on the face of it, or did you find in reality that that was otherwise? If I'm hearing you right, you're saying that on the one hand it really wasn't a television war, it was live, but it was live because you guys chose it to be. You could equally have taped it, run the reports an hour or so later, and been much surer of the facts. Why would a network such as the BBC join in the live rat race?
we joined in with extensive live broadcasting for a period of time in response, I think, to a judgment about the public appetite for information. It's part of our job to try to respond on the occasion of major stories to that kind of demand, and you could measure the accuracy of our judgment in the ratings. People here in Britain, as here, I guess, tired of it after a while. But there's no doubting the appetite for that kind of information. The point that I'm trying to make is not that it was wrong to attempt to provide that kind of public service, to attempt to feed that appetite. What bothers me, and it bothers me about scheduled news programs as much as live television, is the gap between the reality of the war and what passed for reality on television. This was largely a war without corpses, and there's no such thing. We saw some civilian dead at the
Would the public suffer that much, especially since what we tended to hear from those first video clips was that it was the public who was saying, halt, not the media management.
Let me turn the question on its head. Do you seriously think that if we had said, okay, here the world is on the verge of a major conflict here, first time in, what, 45 years that this many countries had been, 29 at that time, engaged in either official or unofficial war, that we thought, well, we know this is happening, but we're not exactly sure exactly what's happening, so we're not going to say anything for an hour or 2 hours or 2 days. I mean, you could argue that we don't know exactly what happened yet during that war, so where do you draw the line? I mean, this week, this conference, this very conference is going to honor a television anchor person who certainly should be honored, whose perhaps most famous broadcast was in 1963 on the assassination of John Kennedy. Now, are you trying to tell me that perhaps what Walter Cronkite should have done that Friday was to come on and say, something has happened in Dallas. We're not exactly sure what it was, but Lyndon Johnson is a name you should get used to. We'll have more at 6. You know, we'll have more details at 6:30. I mean, I think, you know.
So, let's pick up on it. I mean, you're saying live and be damned, the old equivalent of publish and be damned.
I'm saying live because we can go live, and live with all the caution and the expertise and the information.
But you're having
we have
a
at our
cake and
hands.
eating it. You can say live because we can go live, and every you know.
No, but I do say that. I do say live because we can go live. That is what we can offer. We can offer live coverage of an event, and you know, with the
You know you can offer
technology.
that. You don't know whether you can offer every safeguard as a consequence.
No, we don't. And you know, when I echo the comments of the earlier panelists, that this was hardly a television war. I mean, in a war where anywhere upwards of 150 or 200,000 people died, and we didn't see a dead body until day 14 in Kafji, is hardly showing the reality of war. But I mean, what is the option? Is the option saying nothing? That is the ultimate censorship.
Well, the option, if nothing is happening, is that you don't have to be on the air until it is happening, as you elected to do about day 3.
What you're saying, Michael, is that there was never anything of value communicated by live television during the war.
Oh,
and
no,
that's
I'm
patently false. As a matter of fact, although most of the journalists on this platform would prefer to adhere to, you know, the time-honored and pure techniques of documentary television journalism, as developed by pioneers like yourself. But, I mean, we'd much rather be out in the field doing tape reports. The fact is, as Charles said, the technology is here, and we're the people who are working in the networks now, so we've got to use it as best we can.
Oh, I'm not saying that at all.
But frequently, you know, you mentioned unvarnished, untarnished fact. Well, frequently, it was only through live television that we could do that we could circumvent the military censors and official spokesmen and the double talk of this war when, you know, praise be to God, in the words of the Arabs, the war tumbled down on our heads or erupted right in front of the cameras in a position where they couldn't,
we
control it.
We have a bit of a fighting debate going here. I think it's a good point to invite questions. Please, anyone, feel free to pitch any question to any one of the panelists. I can't see with these lights who may be raising their hands. So, is there microphones anyone can step up to?
In most coverage that was given, both American and Canadian, in fact international, the name of the person who was the head of the country that we were at war with was continually given as Saddam. Now, to my understanding, his name, or his title and name in combination, were President Saddam Hussein. And as I've searched through clippings and paper, I've never found references of allies as Maggie, or as Leonid, or even Adolf or Benito. And I'm concerned as to the perception of the way in which people have perceived the war, how this was affected by the fact that the opinion given through the reporting with using his first name may have affected people's perceptions.
Okay. Peter Mansbridge, can you elicit what the guidelines were and how, was it a them and us situation, or Canada and Iraq?
Well, 2 points. First, on the direct point of the question. Actually, on our broadcast, you didn't hear him being referred to as Saddam. You heard him being referred to as either Saddam Hussein or Hussein. And I agree with your point about it. On the question of we made a decision very early on in our coverage of this war that it wasn't an us and they war. We never referred to Canada as we, our troops are that. And we took a fair degree of criticism for that from some people.
Charles Weber, you were the network that had probably the longest international reach. Now, did you have strict guidelines on such matters as forms of address, and were there strictures on all of you to remember that you were not just talking to a home audience, but to an international one?
Absolutely. There's no question about that. It became evident very early on, as it has been for some time, that our audience is not solely American, not solely North American, and not solely Western. We reach into some 100 countries in varying degrees. One of the things that, excuse me, that we did try to do was to be precisely that, not to get involved in the we versus they approach to this. I would concede that at times, and particularly when you're doing live television, it's very easy to lapse back into that. I did one interview with the Vice President, Mr. Quayle, in the course of this, in which I very carefully made reference to your troops, Mr. Vice President, and got nasty letters from people saying, well, I presume you're an American, they're your troops too. But that was not the point. They are not my troops. I don't command them, nor does CNN, nor do any news organizations whatsoever. So they're very much the President's troops or American troops, and you do need to make those distinctions. I do believe that probably all of us can say that we at least made an effort to be clear and unequivocal about this.
Yeah, I would acknowledge that perfectly. Of course there are standards, and of course that's the way it should be, but as a Canadian covering a war that was seen, largely speaking, as an American war, I was dismayed on my own network and others to see the extent to which patriotism entered into the coverage. I don't think there's any denying it. I mean, on CBS, on NBC, ABC, the first person plural was used on frequent occasions.
Could I raise...
I think, in a sense, as a Canadian who was there for an American outfit, felt that I was in a bit of a privileged position because I wasn't inclined to do that. And I think it was easier for me to stay away from that kind of nationalism. But it happened, there's no doubt about it.
Will you get a strict memo back for having said this?
Michael, who's here?
maybe it's time to move on to our second video clip, which shows some of the repercussions of war covered live, waiting for death, notably in Israel under missile attack. We call it the fog of war.
You are watching CBS News' continuing coverage of Showdown in the Gulf. From CBS News headquarters in New York, here is Dan Rather.
We have news breaking out. We go to Tom Fenton in Israel.
Okay, this is Tom Fenton in Tel Aviv. We heard an air raid siren, and then just about a minute ago, there was a huge blast. We're not yet sure what it was. We're all in the sealed-up chemical warfare protection room and in the process of putting on our gas masks. I'm putting mine on right now.
The civil defense here is telling everyone to put their gas mask on and go into a sealed room. At the moment, I'm ignoring that order. Some people here at the Bureau are putting their gas mask on, and I may do the same very soon.
Martin, what's the latest?
Well, Tom, this gas mask may come in useful after all. We've been told that one of the warheads that fell in central Tel Aviv had a chemical warhead. That's from our man who's listening to the police frequencies.
All right,
but with
put on the gas mask.
I think I will, actually, this time.
Yeah, all right, let's go ahead and do that.
No time for heroics.
No. We'll tell you that there have been missiles launched in Israel. It appears now, based on early police radio reports, radio reports that one of them may have contained a chemical warhead. We do not want to in any way panic anyone who's looking in on all of this.
Military sources are confirming that 5 missiles, I repeat, 5 missiles have fallen in the Tel Aviv area. They believe they were chemical warheads. He doesn't know how. I don't know how he knows that. This is what military sources are telling him.
Tom, we have confirmation of six missile launches from the western desert of Iraq into Tel Aviv.
Still a great deal of confusion over whether or not it is a chemical missile attack or a conventional missile attack. Both reports have been out tonight, all unconfirmed. The only thing that we know for sure is that missiles have landed and that the escalation of the Gulf War is now fully underway.
We know very little. It's time for one of Admiral and Walter Cronkite's favorite words, which is steady. There's a lot here we don't know.
I'm trying to see if I can hear any audio. Just playing music. Very slow, somber music.
We have one large building in Tel Aviv that has collapsed from a missile, and we have confirmation that the victims of chemical war have been taken to that very hospital that I mentioned earlier. So it looks pretty serious.
As you pointed out, Martin, this is the first chemical attack on a city in history, and here is a man who portrays himself as a pious defender after all the Islamic faith, and he will stoop, he will do almost anything.
We're going now to WCBS TV reporter Jim Johnson. The veteran anchorman is on the telephone now from Jerusalem. Jim, I want to make sure I understand. You heard on Israeli radio, the Israelis announced that the Israeli Air Force was in the process of retaliating for the Scud missile attacks.
Yes.
If you can have
I saw the jets myself headed, Dan, toward Iraq.
The indications we're receiving from Israeli sources in Washington is that the Israeli Air Force will undertake a massive retaliatory strike. The implication, of course, now being that Israel will retaliate.
There is corroboration from U.S. sources that that report on Israeli radio is correct, and that Israel is now in the process of retaliating for this attack.
Yes, David, they told us it's okay to take our mask off. The civil defense has told us it's okay to take our mask off. I'm trying to catch my breath. This is a very unpleasant experience.
Let's see, we want to go now to back to Israel because there are some late developments. The story may have taken another very sharp turn.
Yes, Tom, I've just heard from an extremely high military source, a completely reliable source of ours, that there was no chemical attack on Tel Aviv, no nerve gas on Tel Aviv.
It's very tough to engage in any kind of rational decision-making when this kind of thing is going on. Here we have the most sophisticated of the Israeli cities, a missile attack into the middle of it, and for almost 2 hours we're led to believe that it might have been a nerve gas attack of some kind. It changes the equation wildly. There's the possibility of jets being scrambled, somebody doing something that we wouldn't want them to do. How do you make a decision?
It's one of the things that really does, it requires people to be cool
and not to jump at the first piece of information.
Is that the future that we're looking at? The reporters were, if not inventing things, were under pressure that they not normally would have been under. Certainly anchors editorializing in lieu of facts quite clearly.
that we had spent months hearing about, the capabilities of both sides. There wasn't an expert in the world who wasn't saying that the Iraqis had chemical warfare capability and would use it. We had the president of Iraq saying he would use it, and he would use it against Israel. Suddenly, missiles were falling, not a common sight to anyone. Missiles were falling in Israel, and people jumped to certain conclusions, and not just journalists. When you watch that tape, I mean, Martin Fletcher and Tom Fenton are not journalists who just fell out of journalism school yesterday. They have years, if not decades, of experience covering not only the Middle East, but international events. They have sources. Fletcher talked of the sources he had, who I'm sure were also as convinced that night, wrongly as it turned out, but given the events that led up to that night, that the likelihood of chemical warfare was used. And it's surprising in those clips the number of times you hear anchors like Brokaw and others saying may have been used. The word definitives used as well, which did turn out to be incorrect.
Peter, I'm not sure what the defense is here. Quite simply,
I think
in that kind of fluid situation, why could you not have taped and there was an hour or so's delay if demonstrably there was so much inaccuracy going on?
You know, interballistic missiles had been used first time in a war other than the Iran-Iraq war. And, you know, the world, in fact, was at war. 29 nations were. Canada was at war. We're going to prevent our public from being aware that missiles were landing in Israel. The debate here was not over whether missiles had landed. They had. It was clear they had. The debate was whether or not
times that
I felt uncomfortable the first 3 nights of the war, given the very fact that I knew the story would be changing, the facts would be changing, as they were said, by different officials from different countries. It's up to us at that time to be continually conditioning and warning our audience, as we did, of, as you call it, the fog of war. The very fact that while officials from both sides may not lie to you about what's going on, the odds are they're not telling you the truth either. And you have to be weighing all those kind of statements and facts that are coming out and warning your audiences. You know, many of us were that night.
Peter Bell, to the BBC, which is deservedly famous for its standards. In this case, what evidentiary standards did you set? And by that I mean, how did you weigh the risks of live reporting against the need for proper sourcing that you'd normally adhere to?
I think that those of you of a nervous disposition need to be warned that you may be about to witness an editor falling on his sword. The only crumb of comfort I can derive from that tape is that the producer in his infinite mercy chose not to include a clip from the BBC. We thought, because we were aware of what the dangers were going to be, that we had systems in place which would stop this kind of thing happening. I don't think on occasions like this that I would want to be an anchor even for an anchor's salary, but the truth is, although we weren't the first and we weren't alone, that we fell into the same trap that everybody else did. I don't think it helps in retrospect to go back and look at the fine print and say, well, we said may have or could be. The fact of the matter is it happened in Britain, and I hear from colleagues in the United States that it happened in the United States. People in significant numbers were ringing relatives in Israel because they believed there'd been a chemical attack, and that's down to us. I'm afraid I take a pretty extreme view about this. I think the fact that the story was so important and the fact that we were aware that there was the potential for such a big story, far from excusing it, makes the sin worse. I wasn't there, but what I suspect happened, because I've seen it happen in vaguely similar situations before, is that on the ground, Parche, the nature of some of the sources, what you get is a kind of information howl round. Everybody's waiting for it. The broadcasters are watching each other's output. The authorities and the journalists are both asking each other what's happening. Everybody's reading the agencies, and all of a sudden, bang, somebody reports the rumor, and hey presto, Armageddon is at hand. I think that the rumor, of course, is not a fact, but the fact that the rumor's been reported becomes in itself a sort of quasi-fact that then gets passed around. What do we do about it? Well, in logistical broadcasting terms, we try to tighten up our systems. We try to protect the anchor somewhat and put him at one stage removed from this information. But in the end, you can't write a book of rules to get yourself off this hook. In the end, it's going to come down to a degree of caution proportionate to the importance of the story and to the exercise of good old-fashioned editorial judgment. If anybody ever asks me, and you may think the pressures of competition are less in Britain than they are in the States, but it's not that comfortable. If anybody ever asks me straight out, puts me in a corner and says, if you've got a choice, would you rather have it first or have it right? I'd rather have it right.
We've heard from the managerial side. Let's turn to the guys who really face these pressures in the field to be accurate. Arthur Kent, I see you've been scribbling away there. To what extent do you feel pushed as a reporter in that kind of situation to make assumptions? You may have come out of a briefing with some various information. You're on live. You're straight from the desert to the living room, and you can probably hear everybody else. Well, the camera all around you.
You know, I discovered in Afghanistan over the course of many years, seeing the gloss that had been put on the reputation of the Western-backed guerrillas slowly dissolve away when confronted with the facts of the corruption of their leadership. That when you go to a story, you only report what you see and what you hear, or as Peter has said, what you know to be right, or what at least you can present to your audience and qualify as saying, okay, I saw this, I've just spoken to someone reasonably trustworthy who did see this. We in Dhahran, during those attacks, were fortunate enough to be able to see and to photograph what was going on. We were well in advance of the curve of information control that had been established by the U.S. military and the official spokesman in Washington and Riyadh. We could count how many Patriots went out. We saw detonations. We saw debris and missiles hitting the ground. And the practices we adopted there under circumstances of live coverage were the same thing we'd do in any other circumstance. Mike Betcher and Jeff Riggins, one of our cameramen, immediately drove through the darkness to the area that we'd seen some of the debris impact and came back within 20 minutes to say, yes, indeed, 2 missiles had collided. People had seen this happen and the junk had hit the ground. So there was something that we could report live very, very swiftly, and we had legitimate information. I mean, we've seen a lot of the worst moments of what we as journalists can currently do with the technology. I don't share the feeling that by cutting back or slowing down the process, we can somehow improve it. My own fear is that just opens up whole new opportunities for censorship, for official and political control. But my source of misgiving is that I don't think that the television networks and newspapers and wire agencies are now looking at things like this. I think, you know, it certainly struck Peter, it struck myself, all of us who were involved felt, okay, we've come up short in certain respects. But I don't think our organizations understand how badly we let ourselves down, surrendering control of our medium and our craft to the official censors, and just how young, how much in its infancy the whole process of live reporting is, and how much work has to be done, and how much additional training has to be given young journalists who now have to make the decisions that Peter is making and that you, Michael, have made throughout your career on a split-second basis, on the basis of what they see or hear, the rumor. I can't go with this as a fact, it's just a rumor. But the time frame, through the instantaneous nature of our medium, is now being compressed, and that means we have to be better, perhaps superhuman.
Brian?
I feel that, I agree with many of the comments here, that I think that we have made a pact with live coverage of war. The first thing you learn about war is that there really is a fog of war. And when you see live war, we have to alert the public that is watching, and they have to be part of the process of realizing that there is fog, there's potential misinformation, there's warnings to be made, and we must drive that home over and over again. I think the delay is, again, a dangerous thing. I agree with Arthur. It falls into the hands of military manipulation, as it has happened in the past. And also it has the potential to increase the state of panic. Again, going back to the sort of the man's bridge flipping the coin, if we had reported that despite the major story almost of the last week had been threats by Iraq to hit Israel with chemical weapons, we were only to report that a rocket had landed in Tel Aviv, that there was a good deal of unrest, but details in 4 or 5 hours.
Necessarily mistaken reporting, but mistaken information. As you listen to these people, they were saying, an Israeli official is telling me that, or you saw Fred Francis sitting at the Pentagon saying, officials here have confirmed. Now, Fred doesn't go out and say these things on his own hook. You use the word inventing early on. We don't invent.
I didn't say you in particular.
No, but you said us.
What?
You're talking about my craft.
There was a clip there where we hailed reporters saying the Israelis are counterattacking. They scrambled their jets. I've seen seen it myself.
That's right.
What is that but inventing?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily inventing. If there is a source there, if there is someone telling him that this is what is going on, we'd certainly heard the Israelis say that we will counterattack. This will not go unanswered. The point that I want to make, though, is this, Michael. We don't create the stuff. We report it as well as we can. In terms of this question of delay that you raised, this is a different age than when Britain was under the Blitz. If we didn't report it, somebody's aunt or uncle in Tel Aviv would be on the phone to New York or Toronto saying, all hell is breaking loose, the sky is falling down upon us. What we have the capacity to do is bring that, one would hope, in a better context. Yes, the first night when the Scuds started coming down was a panic. Nobody knew what they were experiencing. No one had been in that situation before. I would argue that as time went on, things calmed down. We didn't jump at every air raid siren. We'd get on and we'd try and ascertain what it was. There was a learning curve here that was very swift, and it had to be, because we didn't want to panic people. Sure, you saw people running around with gas masks. Yes, there was misinformation, but it wasn't misinformation that was necessarily generated by the reporters.
Please understand, I'm not advocating returning to an age of news by pigeons, We're not against reporting.
Well, that's my point. You can't go back.
Pause and report.
Well, pause, of course, but what would you consider a legitimate pause.
Even an hour's delay in situations of great uncertainty such as that. But
what
information moves too
uncertain about
fast.
that night? What was uncertain about that night? It was not uncertain that Iraq had attacked Israel. That was not uncertain. That was known. The war had escalated. The issue of chemical weapons was one that clearly was overstated in some areas on that tape. The question of retaliation. You know, what did that journalist say about retaliation? That he had witnessed Israeli jets taking off. Then he went on and assumed that that meant a massive retaliatory strike. I would be greatly surprised if Israeli jets were not launched in the air that night. Where they went, I don't know. But the fact that their country was under missile attack, I assume jets went in the air, and I assume that's what he reported, that he saw jets go in the air. He took it one step too far as to what he was saying they were doing once they got in the air. But I mean, you know, let's not lose sight of what happened that night. 24 hours into the war, a third country was involved. Iraq had attacked not one of its combatants, but the country that had said it would if it was attacked, and said it would with chemical weapons. And if I just can't conceive of any condition under which we would have waited to see how this thing was going to clarify itself out over there. I mean, we still don't know to this day.
Let me put a question to Birgit. You traveled around Europe.
I wasn't meant to step in before, so it's okay.
Birgit should have leapt in earlier. Germany being a non-combatant, do you think the coverage was more sober or less frenzied?
Oh, no. I mean, what you have talked about now reminds me very much of the things that were going on in Germany at the time. Of course, there was first the preparatory phase, so to say, where people waited, what is going to happen, when is the ultimatum being, so to say, given or not. And then the first night when the war was on, so to say, it was like a kind of, everyone was going mad because journalists, including media journalists and the journalists of the press, they all wanted, as you said, in different ways, to be there. They wanted to report, and so there was a kind of competition going on very quickly then between our ARD and ZDF, our public chains, and the private ones, who had more access to the very, very famous CNN boys, as they soon were called, and they were far better off because they could report live, whereas ARD and ZDF were, their technical equipment is much worse than CNN's, and so it was a kind of absurd competition going on. Well, who is best now? And this led to a kind of it was a war like being a big sports event or some major breakdown at the stock exchange, and there was no difference first whether we were involved or not on the military base. It changed a little later on when one was getting more reflective, also reflecting the possible mistakes journalists must make in this well, new and live war, and the ability or the preparation to talk about we journalists can also make something wrong was then in a later time also part of a coverage which was more reflective, and as Peter said, first to get it right or to get there first was also reflected, but only later on. At first I think it was as it was everywhere, and as you say, I mean, you have to be there, and the public wants to know as much as possible. The question how right it is, what it knows, that comes second.
Are there any questions?
It was a very high-tech war. There was a lot of detachment, lack of emotion, because there weren't a lot of casualties being reported initially. And yet when you saw the Tom Brokaw, Martin Fletcher interview, it seemed to pull in the audience's emotions in terms of, is he going to die? Is this for real? And I'm wondering, the question is, further to that, you also saw at several points, they brought the reporter live in the homes of several Israeli families where they were teaching little children how to wear gas masks. Does that itself become news? Is it the actual emotional state at the time?
Bob, is it part of the dramatics?
I wouldn't be surprised if, to a certain extent, it became part of the dramatics. Yeah. But I certainly, though I wasn't in Iran at that point, when the Scuds first started falling, I can understand how there were legitimate concerns by everybody there. Yeah. And if that was good TV, well, so be it. So much better. So much the better.
You know, Bob's right. I mean, let's face it, there were some guys who used these things as props. And they used it to get on the air.
And look prettier.
And, you know, to hell with them. And they're not going to last in the business, I hope. And we've got to make sure that they don't. But people here should understand, you know, just how confusing and terrifying it is. The most terrifying thing that I found was watching human beings run in panic at the sound of the sirens, knowing there was a missile coming, and thinking, oh, that one's got my name on it. And seeing them scramble down the stairs. We had guys, you know, wrench their backs, almost break their legs running down the stairway. You know, we stayed out, all the major networks kept going, we kept transmitting. It didn't make sense because we had been told by military officials there, no chance nuclear, unlikely chemical, but we don't know how many Scuds there are because General Schwarzkopf had proudly said he destroyed all the launchers on Friday night. And Sunday afternoon, halftime in the football game, there we were under the most concerted and intense attack yet. So, you know, we didn't know what was going on. And that was what we tried to do in our broadcasts. And, you know, as silly as it may look, listening to Martin and Tom there, they're trying to take you step by step through the painful process of trying to establish what's going on. But please try to remember our mindset. We were in a situation where we had been bottled up, where we were watching truth being squeezed through a very narrow bottleneck. And suddenly, here we were witnessing part of the war. We could see it, and we were going to present it to people as best we could, as accurately as we could.
I did think sometimes in the Duran coverage, it was the most bizarre part of the war of all. I have no heroic stories. I put on my gas mask once, tried to run up 3 flights of stairs and collapsed. Basically, I couldn't breathe. I forgot you shouldn't really run in them. But I did notice that, you know, some of these stand-ups in the night, it was a bit like dangling somebody by their heels over Niagara Falls and say, give me a feel for what you're feeling right now. I mean, can you describe the sensation around you in the roar? And as one who didn't have to do this and has enormous admiration for the Arthur Kents and Jaco and that who did this, it does raise the question, if you put somebody in a weird enough position, is this really news? You have a guy out there in the middle of the night, right by an airport, where jets are screaming off right over his head. He can hardly hear. An air raid siren has just gone. A missile's coming towards him, which will probably land in another 6 minutes. And he's supposed to be calmly talking about what the mood is? I mean, of course you're going to get that, but that is not, the normal atmosphere in Duran was not that dramatic.
But the result of that was that in Charles Jaco's case, you got a very real moment, and he's, I think, a bit embarrassed about it now, where he thought he smelled gas, and it turned out to have been the jet fumes going by, and screamed gas and put on his gas mask. Well, that was a legitimate emotion. That was not a manufactured...
It was a legitimate emotion for somebody who was doing the weirdest thing in the world, which is in the middle of an air raid station, standing out there under the lights where he can't see.
But elsewhere in Iran that night, there were people hearing the sirens running, perhaps running with their gas mask in hand, who would have the same sensibility as Charles Jaco. It wouldn't have been in front of a TV camera. But I think there was a certain amount of reality there.
Or under that enormous pressure of knowing the world is watching you as you go through this.
Well, there's that too.
I particularly like the story of the correspondent whose breath was so bad that his colleagues sniffing around thought it was an attack and put on his gas mask.
It seems to me that the crucial element that I hear left out here is the audience. Because, for example, this discussion of live coverage, it seems to me that live coverage is inevitable, it's essential, it's perhaps the only poetry that television has, and that the audience is much more tolerant of mistakes than is perhaps recognized. I mean, the audience can figure out whether it's being scammed or not. I mean, if a television organization will hire, you know, serious people, and they try to do a serious job, well, they'll make mistakes. I mean, everybody makes mistakes. I mean, the notion of objective news I mean, I think it's wonderful for journalists to try to aspire to that, but I don't think anybody, I mean, I think the audience is much more, in fact, often much too sort of easygoing about this. And the other subject that connects to is the one Peter mentioned at the beginning, which is this thing about death and injuries, the horrors of war, which is people have this wonderful mismemory of the Vietnam War coverage as being full of the horrors of war. I mean, almost never. Now, only till the last few years was any death or whatever shown in the Vietnam coverage. But here the audience has a responsibility of its own, because all these entities, the military and the press, are second-guessing the audience and saying, we are acting on the audience's behalf.
It would really be interesting to hear from anybody here whether they think these mistakes were quite understandable and, moreover, acceptable. But next question.
I found that the American news was far too patriotic and trying to make up for, I guess, Vietnam or something. I wasn't sure. But I'm wondering for Peter Mansbridge, if you also were aware of the immense patriotism that was infiltrating a lot of the American news, even with just the people whom they were interviewing, government officials and so on. And as someone who unfortunately does not have the great gaggle of reporters to choose from all over the world that many of the American networks do, when you are choosing the various stories that you're going to use, whether it's BBC or someone from Germany or CNN, do you look at a number of different stories and go, well, we could run this CNN story or we could run this BBC story, but perhaps we may run the BBC story to just get the American patriotism out of it, or the American angle?
We tried to cover the war, and we did, as far as I'm concerned, from a Canadian perspective. We weren't using American network reports, or BBC for that matter, with the exception of Baghdad, when our correspondent had to get out on the day the bombs dropped, as did many other correspondents who were basically forced to leave, and then we spent the rest of the war trying to get back in from Amman, Jordan. The problem that we then had, of course, was the Arnett problem, which I think we're getting to later, and how to deal with that. And so I think I'll keep my comments fairly limited.
In fact, let's move on to that if we can. And among the contradictions of the television war were the mixed emotions, as the lady mentioned, the patriotism, viewer uneasiness with hearing and especially seeing from the other side, and also the pressures of patriotism, maybe in the briefings given by the various national military forces in the coalition. Let's try and recapture all that in this next video segment, which we title Reporting from Both Sides.
Something is happening outside. Peter Arnett, join me here. Let's describe to our viewers what we're seeing. The skies over Baghdad have been illuminated. We hear the sound of planes. They're coming over our hotel. However, we have not yet heard the sound of bombs. But it looks like a 4th of July display at the Washington Monument. The sky is just brightly lighted with all these tracer rounds.
Tom, here it goes. Here it goes now. The sky just full of tracer now. And and there's a very big explosion right up to the west of the city there.
Seen through a night-side lens, the scale of attack and defense can be seen much more clearly. It was terrifying to watch an attack on this scale and so close.
Come to us, come to us. Come to Tel Aviv. We're taking pictures of it right now. We're seeing a bright jet-like, and it does not look like the contrail of an airplane, although we can't be sure.
Richard, it strikes me that you're obviously on some rooftop there as you're calling the play-by-play on this incoming whatever it is, that you're not wearing a gas mask, or do you have it nearby?
I have one nearby, Lou, but really it's a big world, and I don't think the missile's going to get me.
As many of you folks as you can should head to the shelter now.
Mike, get Arthur Kent to run up to the Joint Information Bureau. Get Arthur Kent to find out. We just lost Saudi Arabia. That's not an encouraging sign.
Charles Jaco, fold it up and go, and God bless you, and thank you for that report.
We're thinking about it right now. I think
now,
we should get... Okay, guys, break it down. Out of here.
I must say that this is
the darnest way to conduct an interview.
We never thought we'd see this day where we have to work with gas masks all the time. This is crazy. Well, it's crazy.
This desolate road is destined to become a main battleground in the war which is already raging not very far from here. Bob Simon, CBS News, in the no man's land between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait.
3, 2, 1, launch.
Missile away!
From the bow of the Wisconsin, night launches are even more spectacular.
You can see that's the latest Tomahawk cruise missile to fly just over our position here. And I think there's some more coming in over here. Yarmouk Hospital in Baghdad began to receive its first casualties. They were mostly children today, out playing when the missiles were shot down.
All of you are responsible. All of you. Arming the people for the theft of oil. As if we are Red Indians. We are human beings. You Americans, get out! Get out!
This was an explosion of rage at the Allied bombing and high civilian losses. Later, Iraq took journalists to examine in greater detail the shelter location and its contents.
The U.S. strengthened its insistence today that the bunker was a legitimate military target and that despite the tragic loss of life, there would be no change in American battle plans.
There was a stack of superficial evidence to support the Iraqi claims that the factory was innocently producing baby milk formula, but also nagging doubts like the necessity to camouflage the installation.
It is not an infant formula factory no more than the Rabta chemical plant in Libya made aspirin. It was a biological weapons facility, of that we are sure, and we have taken it out.
The Harrier itself, what kind of aircraft is it to handle and fly?
Oh, it's like a little sports car. Handles very well.
Keep running. Okay, that's looking good. It's all behind us now. Let's get back down.
The Iraqi front line, in this sector at least, put up no resistance, and the Marines have taken thousands of prisoners.
And this man, at least, grateful to be captured.
So eager were they to give up that one group surrendered to an Italian TV cameraman. Then, in a memorable scene, the Iraqis began to chant the name of their enemy.
John Bush! John Bush! John Bush! John Bush! John Bush!
The 6 o'clock news from the BBC.
Kuwait City is liberated.
The first reporter into the Kuwaiti capital, even ahead of the U.S. Marines, was a Canadian, Bob McEwen of CBS News.
They thought we were the U.S. Army, I think, but then we started to set up our satellite station, and they realized that we weren't. And the first question they said was, "Are you CNN?" And I had to say, "No, it's CBS." I said earlier today, I don't know what it would have been like to liberate Paris, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were something like this, except here you can't get a drink.
Same thing here, Bob. So we're going to tackle reporting from both sides. There's an old saying, of course, know your enemy. The alternative is ignorance. On a personal note, I think Peter Arnett did a fabulous job. And having experienced some of what he went through, I do feel strongly that a journalist should only acknowledge one country, and that is journalism. Charles Beerbauer, since you have an international audience as well as the home folk to cater to, do you think CNN was conscious of avoiding overtones of patriotism? Did it do so more, in your opinion, than the other American networks?
Well, I think we were conscious of it. I don't think we always succeeded. There's no question that one of the things that we did was to send one of our reporters, Jeff Flock, all around the country, around the states. He would show up at military bases and interview troops there, and he would show up in hometowns and talk to people about how they felt. A legitimate perspective on American views of the war. Obviously, we didn't do quite the same thing from Baghdad. Doesn't mean we wouldn't have liked to. What Peter Arnett did is, it was the comparable element of it, was to get wherever he could around Iraq to report what was going on the other side. Almost inescapably and regrettably, a lot of patriotism came through where it should not have.
Give us some examples.
Well, you've seen some of the examples, the our troops, and the one that leaps out from that particular piece of film was, Arthur, was Tom Brokaw's reference to Saddam Hussein as a man who would stoop to anything. There was rooting. There's no question about that.
General Schwarzkopf, and I presume to this day, still believes it was the wrong thing to do to have Arnett in Baghdad. First of all, I would have thought that the Central Command benefited to some extent from the things he was telling them. Secondly, I think that presumes that somehow what got across the airwaves from Arnett was a disadvantage to the U.S. position. I think it's just the opposite, you know? I think the thing that was the catalyst was the pictures of the POWs. And this is the example that Schwarzkopf used in his Frost interview. He said when CNN sent those, which all the networks did eventually, sent those pictures of Jeffrey Zahn and his battered face across, it was a disservice to the U.S. side. The fact of the matter is that I think that hardened U.S. resolve. You know, sure, maybe Saddam Hussein thought he was using the American airwaves to further his own cause because he believed Americans didn't have the stomach for this war. The fact of the matter is that once they saw those pictures, I think if there was anybody who felt that way, it turned them completely around.
We shouldn't overlook one major problem here. If as you say, journalists have no country, they have only journalism, there were many hundreds of traitors to that philosophy in this war. The military very cleverly used national ghettos, and there's no getting around it. It was a lesson learned in the Falklands War that you would go to war only with British reporters. And you'd bond British reporters to British units, and soon they become more power than the paratroopers. In this war, despite all the highfalutin talk up here about journalistic principles, let's face it, the American pools were Americans, and they did not let Canadians or any other co-belligerents into those pools, and we were absolutely barred from entering them. The war was fought nationality by nationality, and that was precisely to feed the kind of pro-national feeling that sometimes journalists fell into. I know Arthur fought a very valiant battle on our behalf once, arguing that since Canada, for instance, was the fourth largest Western nation in terms of military contribution, perhaps we should be allowed into the American pool. The CNN representative in the position said no foreign faces. They were pools, were American pools, they were British pools, they were French pools. They were not international pools. By and large, the world was locked out of the military pools that covered that war. So we should not be surprised that there was this element of patriotism that sometimes leapt in. And I think this is a very major problem of that war that we're going to have to address.
Peter Mansbridge, do you think the networks have any leverage in changing the rules for press reporting, the military?
Well, I hate to admit it, but the leverage has to be applied in New York and Washington by the American networks. I mean, this, we can talk all we want about how this was a multinational war. In fact, it was an American war. And the rules of the game were laid out as far as the media's access at the Pentagon, not in Ottawa. The snapshot lessons that I think we have, that if I was doing this over again, what would I do differently? Would have focused less on the Scuds through the war and more on what was happening in Iraq. I mean, when you consider, now I heard Schwarzkopf, that wonderful clip of Schwarzkopf, talking about Hussein, he's this, but he's not a general. Well, Schwarzkopf's a great general, but he's not a journalist. And, a lot of people got fascinated by the things Schwarzkopf said. When we were focusing on Scuds because we could see them, Schwarzkopf now says there were 3,000 pounds per minute of bombs dropping on Iraq for 42 days. Well, you sure had no sense of that from anybody's coverage from the war, whether it was television or the great print media. You didn't get that sense. I think we would have had to try to do something differently. But my biggest I feel our biggest failure, as is often in the case of media coverage of war, is not what we did during it, but what we've done since it. War has this thing about diving off the front page almost the minute it's over. And this one has. I know Bob's just been back to Kuwait City to do a special for July 4th, and I know the Journal has been back. But for the most part, we have abandoned that story. We covered the problems in northern Iraq, but there's been a very quick disinterest in that story, not only on the part of the media, but on the part of the public, and that's a failure on our side.
We're going to have to leave it there. There may be lots more questions, and I'm sure everybody on the panel is ready to adjourn to the Delegates Lounge and chat about them there for a while. So for now, I want to thank Bob McEwen, Birgit Weidinger, Peter Mansbridge, Arthur Kent, Peter Bell, Michael Arland, Brian Stewart, and Charles Beerbauer. I'd like also to thank Carol Law and Brian Foley, the conference coordinators, the CBC's Ottawa Bureau Chief, Ellie Alboyne, who produced this, the First Lady of CBC News, Trina McQueen, and on a personal note, to pay a tribute to the lady who heads up the program that's run on Newsworld, and of course referring to Joan Donaldson, who's been ill for a long, long time, and our great hope and prayer is that Joan is on her way back to us. Thank you all.